It's time to finally do it. It's time for World War II. And let me just say this, it's gonna be epic. And now back to our regularly scheduled programming. World War II is by far the largest war in human history. So large, in fact, that it was fought across 5 continents, involving more than 2 billion people, almost a third of humanity. We're going to need a bigger boat. The war would not only feature all the major world powers fighting against one another, but also result in the creation of new superpowers, the use of weapons of unimaginable destruction, and profound global change. But before we dive into this madness, I want to take a moment to thank you guys for being so supportive of my channel and its transition from classic literature to history. I am excited to bring you these videos on some of history's most interesting events. If you like this sort of thing, please do me a favor and subscribe. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get learning. So in order to tell the story of World War II, we have to first look at how Europe got to this point. After the First World War, Europe was left in sharp decline. Not only had the war resulted in around 18 million deaths, but it had completely broken apart the once great empires of Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and Germany. There were now new countries and borders all over Europe, with the Austro-Hungarians breaking up into Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Russia had been taken over by the Bolsheviks and turned into the Soviet Union, while Germany had lost all of its overseas colonies and suffered territorial losses on the Western Front. There were now millions of people identified themselves as stateless, with the right of self-determination causing mass migrations. But despite all this upheaval, by the end of the 1920s, Europe did seem to be stabilizing. New democracies were established in Eastern Europe. Fascism had come to Italy and communism had come to Russia. Meanwhile, an economic recovery was underway. Then there was Germany, who were not happy with their post-war situation. They felt that they had been unfairly treated, and the Treaty of Versailles was extremely unpopular. To make things worse, the Great Depression hit hard in Germany, and unemployment skyrocketed. This led to the election of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, which would set in motion the chain of events that would lead to war. The Nazis would quickly begin rearming, which violated the Treaty of Versailles. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin became increasingly paranoid of the West and began forming alliances with nations like France and the United Kingdom. As Europe edged closer towards war, so too did the rest of the world. Japan, Italy, and Germany would become allies, and together they would begin a campaign of aggression, kicking off the Second World War. On September 1, 1939, Germany would invade Poland, marking the beginning of the war. 2 days later, Britain and France would declare war on Germany. But unlike the previous war, when the Western Front opened, this time around they were not prepared. In fact, within 2 weeks, Poland was already overrun, and the Allies were looking for a way out. Many people thought that after Poland fell, France would be next. In order to avoid this, the Allies launched the famous Battle of Britain, hoping to wear down the German Air Force. While the Allies struggled against the Germans, much of Europe would fall. After Poland, Denmark and Norway were occupied, the Germans set their sights on the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, the Germans would launch a surprise attack on the Soviets, kicking off the largest land invasion in military history. While the Germans made impressive gains, the Soviets proved to be a tough opponent. By the end of the year, the Germans had been pushed back. But something was wrong. In December of 1941, Japan would attack Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the conflict. This caused the Germans to shift their focus to North Africa, where they hoped to capture the Suez Canal. The battle lines were drawn, with the British and Americans taking control of Egypt, while the Italians and Germans took control of Libya. The war in Africa would become a brutal attritional war. Eventually, American forces under the command of George Patton would push the Germans all the way back to Tunis. But meanwhile, back in Europe, the Soviets were on the offensive, pushing the Germans all the way back to the outskirts of Moscow. By 1943, the tide of war was turning. At the Battle of Stalingrad, German forces were surrounded and forced to surrender. Soon after, the Soviets would push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. On May 8, 1945, Germany would surrender, marking the end of the war in Europe. But the war in Asia was just getting started. Early on, the Japanese had swept through much of Southeast Asia, establishing puppet states wherever they went. Their goal was to establish a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But the reality was, they just wanted to exploit the region for their own benefit. The Japanese had committed atrocities all across Asia, but none as destructive as what would happen in China. The Japanese invasion of China had begun even before the start of the Second World War. By 1945, the Chinese had suffered between 15 and 20 million deaths. By 1944, the Allies were ready to take back the Pacific. American forces would take the island of Guam, followed by the Philippines. The Japanese were entrenched on the island of Leyte. With superior numbers, the Japanese attacked the Americans at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This would be the largest naval battle in history, resulting in the sinking of 4 Japanese battleships. After the battle, the Americans continued to push north. By early 1945, American forces would land on the island of Iwo Jima, only to find the Japanese well entrenched. Every inch of the island would be contested. By February, the Americans had taken the island, but at a cost. Over 6,000 Americans would die during the battle. In April of 1945, President Roosevelt would die and be replaced by Harry Truman. Just a month later, the Germans would surrender, leaving Truman with a decision to make. Should he push for a quick end to the war, or should he explore peace with the Japanese? He would decide to go for broke. On August 6, 1945, the United States would drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb would be dropped on Nagasaki. On September 2, 1945, Japan would surrender, ending the war. When we think of World War II, we usually picture images of European cities being bombed or soldiers marching through the snow. But the war in Asia was just as deadly, if not more so. During the course of the war, an estimated 85 million people died, making it the deadliest conflict in human history. Europe was devastated, especially Germany and the Soviet Union, both of whom were completely flattened. In fact, prior to the war, Germany had a population of 85 million, while after the war, only 72 million remained. Europe was in ruins. The United States and the Soviet Union were now the most powerful nations in the world. The British and Japanese empires were shattered, and the world was entering a new era. As we saw in our last video, the Second World War had profound effects on society, economy, and culture. The war had been global in scale, meaning that colonial subjects were heavily involved in the conflict. This resulted in many colonized people experiencing life outside of the rigid confines of their societies, allowing them to gain new ideas and perspectives, which they would eventually use to fight for independence. The war had also seen the rise of totalitarianism, which resulted in unprecedented levels of violence. Survivors of the war were left disillusioned and searching for answers, leading to a cultural revolution. To learn more about the effects of the Second World War, click here for our video on the Cold War. Or, if you want something else entirely, click here. Subscribe if you want us to keep making these videos, and I shall oblige.